Good afternoon from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of SpaceflightNow.com, and welcome to our live coverage of the launch of an Atlas V rocket scheduled for 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 2200 UTC this evening from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. You're looking at a live view of the Atlas V out on Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral. Cryogenic tanking is now underway. Cryogenics are now flowing into the vehicle to feed the engines on board the Atlas V. Right now, the Centaur upper stage on the Atlas V rocket is about 60% full of its oxygen. Loading of liquid oxygen into the first stage and liquid hydrogen into the second stage has not yet begun. There was some bad weather that rolled through the area earlier this afternoon that briefly held up some launch preparations. But ULA was able to finish all their hands-on work at the pad with the pad team, and those personnel are now evacuated to a fallback position, clearing the way for the on-time start of cryogenic loading and tanking of the Atlas V in today's countdown. So right now, liftoff remains scheduled for the opening of tonight's 2-hour window. That 2-hour window opens at 6 p.m. on the dot Eastern Time, 2200 UTC. This mission is designated USSF-12, United States Space Force 12. It'll be carrying two experimental satellites into geosynchronous orbit for the U.S. Space Force. One of these satellites will be testing an experimental next-generation infrared sensing instrument that will be used, or could be used, this technology, in future missile detection and missile warning applications. The Space Force operates a fleet of missile warning satellites. These satellites are designed with very sensitive infrared instruments to detect the heat plumes from missile launches. And the instrument on board the Tech Demo satellite going up on this mission is a next generation instrument that could be used on future missile warning satellites later in the 2020s. The other payload on board this mission is called USSF-12 Ring. It's the USSF-12 Ring spacecraft. It rides below this experimental missile warning satellite inside the payload shroud of the Atlas V. And this particular spacecraft carries an array of classified technology experiments for the Space Force. The Space Force hasn't released much information on the details of those experiments other than to say that these experiments will be hosted on this USSF-12 Ring spacecraft built by Northrop Grumman, which will deploy separately from the missile warning Tech Demo satellite on this mission. So two spacecraft heading up to geosynchronous orbit tonight on the Atlas V rocket. This orbit is located about 22,000 miles, or nearly 36,000 kilometers over the equator. And the Atlas V and the Centaur upper stage will take about 6 hours and 5 minutes from the time of launch until the final spacecraft is deployed. Right now, the weather conditions are observed green for launch according to United Launch Alliance, as of a few minutes ago at least. And the official weather outlook for tonight's 2-hour window calls for a 60% chance of favorable weather conditions during that time period. So launch is now 1 hour, 53 minutes, and 30 seconds away. The countdown continues to target the opening of the 2-hour window at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 2200 UTC. Now 1 hour and 50 minutes until launch. The graphic on the left side of your screen shows the current propellant levels in the 4 main propellant tanks on the Atlas V rocket. The Centaur upper stage is now 90% full of liquid oxygen. This is the super cold oxidizer that will be consumed in combination with liquid hydrogen, which will be loaded into the Centaur upper stage later in the countdown this afternoon. So that tank is 90% full, the upper stage liquid oxygen or LOX tank. On the Atlas booster stage, the RP1 or kerosene fuel tank is 100% full. About 25,000 gallons of kerosene was loaded into the Atlas first stage yesterday afternoon after the rocket rolled out to the launch pad yesterday. And preparations will soon pick up for loading of cryogenic liquid oxygen into the first stage. The reason the kerosene can be loaded so far in advance is it's stored at room temperature and does not boil off in the warm ambient air here in Central Florida. However, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen are stored to several hundred degrees below zero and do boil off in the Florida air throughout the countdown. So those commodities, those propellants usually aren't loaded into the rocket until closer to launch. In this case, beginning about 2 hours prior to launch for an Atlas V rocket. Throughout this cryogenic loading process in this Atlas V countdown, about 66,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen will be loaded into the vehicle. Again, 25,000 gallons of RP1, which is a highly refined kerosene, is already on board and has been on the first stage since yesterday. The rest of the propellants on board this vehicle are encased in 4 solid rocket boosters that are mounted on each side of the core stage of the Atlas V. Those casings are produced by Northrop Grumman and are cast with propellant at the factory. And so those boosters are already have their pre-packed propellant on board and will burn that propellant in the first minute and a half or minute and 40 seconds of today's launch. The first stage of the Atlas V is powered by a Russian-made RD-180 main engine made by a company called MPO Energomash in Russia, just outside of Moscow. This will be the 100th flight of an RD-180 engine. 94 of those, after today's flight, 94 of those will have been on Atlas V rockets. And then there were 6 RD-180 engines that flew on the previous generation Atlas III family. That was the bridge program between the V, which is made with different tankage and is re-engined with this RD-180 engine. The upper stage, the Centaur segment of the vehicle, is powered by an Aerojet Rocketdyne RL-10 engine. One engine on that upper stage will be fired on 3 burns during tonight's mission to maneuver these 2 U.S. Space Force experimental payloads into their targeted orbit over the equator at geosynchronous altitude, which is a little more than 22,000 miles. In fact, tonight's mission will be targeting an orbit at about 22,440 miles. That's nearly 36,000 kilometers. That's actually slightly above geosynchronous altitude where these two satellites will be deployed. They'll be deployed outside of the geosynchronous belt to ensure there's no space debris or anything left in that geosynchronous belt, which is a heavily trafficked region of space with a lot of operating satellites and a lot of space debris. And then once the satellites are deployed in that slightly higher orbit, they will use their own propulsion to maneuver down to the geosynchronous altitude, which is around 22,236 miles. And the fast fill of the Atlas first stage with liquid oxygen has just started a few minutes ago, and ULA's launch team reports that tank is now 20% full. The Atlas first stage's liquid oxygen tank, volume-wise, is the largest tank to be filled during the countdown, with 48,800 gallons of liquid oxygen going into that tank. And we've just heard confirmation that the liquid oxygen tank on the Centaur upper stage is now at flight level at 100%, and that will slowly be replenished throughout the rest of the countdown as that hydrogen, which is chilled to more than 400 degrees below zero, boils off throughout the countdown. So that's the first of the 3 cryogenic tanks to be filled. So just to recap where the cryogenic tanking process is right now, the Centaur upper stage has been loaded with about 4,150 gallons of cryogenic oxidizer. That's the first of the 3 oxidizer tanks to be, or 3 propellant tanks, cryogenic tanks to be loaded during the countdown. The first stage liquid oxygen tank at last report was 20% full. This tank will eventually hold 48,800 gallons of liquid oxygen. Again, this liquid oxygen is chilled to cryogenic temperatures near 300 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. And the liquid hydrogen fuel tank on the Centaur upper stage has not begun loading at this point. A few moments ago, we heard from ULA's launch team that they were convening an anomaly team to study a faulty measurement in what we think is part of the propellant utilization system on the Atlas V rocket. We don't have any more details on what that measurement or that issue might be, but the engineers on the anomaly team, which study these problems or glitches that may come up during the countdown, are now analyzing this measurement to see whether it can be recovered or what the impact may or may not be for the rest of the countdown. So we'll stand by for the outcome of that analysis as the countdown continues right now to tick down toward a T0 or launch time of 6 p.m. Eastern Time or 2200 UTC. Now 1 hour and 21 minutes and 30 seconds until the opening of tonight's launch window for the United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket, which you're seeing now live at Space Launch Complex 41 as cryogenic tanking continues. Right now the launch team is in the midst of that cryogenic loading process. The Atlas first stage is now 70% full at last report of its eventual supply of about 48,800 gallons of liquid oxygen chilled to about minus 300 degrees Fahrenheit. The liquid oxygen tank on the Centaur upper stage has already been fully loaded. And now the Centaur hydrogen tank is now being loaded and was just reported at 10% full. So cryogenics now on all inside all four tanks at various levels. Well, cryogenics in 3 tanks. The Atlas fuel tank, the RP1 tank, is holding about 25,000 gallons of highly refined rocket propellant 1, which is a highly refined kerosene. That's stored at room temperature. And Atlas liquid oxygen just reached the 80% mark. So the cryogenic tanking process is continuing and is now past the halfway point overall of the 66,000 gallons in total of cryogenics being loaded into the vehicle this afternoon. This graphic from United Launch Alliance shows the various components of the Atlas V rocket that'll be flying this evening. This particular rocket is flying in the 541, the 541 configuration. Those numerals represent different attributes and characteristics of this particular configuration. The 5 represents the fact that this rocket is flying with a 5-meter diameter payload fairing, the wider version of the 2 different versions of payload fairings that ULA offers for Atlas V missions. The number 4 represents the 4 strap-on solid rocket boosters on this mission. And the number 1 notes that there is 1 RL-10 engine on the Centaur upper stage. Most Atlas V missions do fly with a single engine on the upper stage, the only exception being missions that carry Boeing's Starliner crew capsule into orbit. Those missions fly with a dual engine Centaur. This graphic also shows the artist's concepts of the 2 payloads that are flying on this mission, and those payloads are now buttoned up inside the payload fairing on top of the Atlas V. At the top or uppermost position of this dual payload stack is the Wide Field of View Testbed spacecraft. This spacecraft was built by Millennium Space Systems. It's a subsidiary of Boeing and carries an infrared sensor supplied by L3 Harris. And this spacecraft will be testing this next generation infrared sensor for future applications in missile detection, missile warning, and missile tracking for the U.S. Space Force, part of the Space Force's next family of missile warning satellites to eventually replace the space-based infrared system, or SBIRS satellites. The last of this SBIRS satellites actually is scheduled to launch on the next Atlas V rocket in late July. So this particular mission is helping pave the way for what comes after the SBIRS constellation completes their mission later this decade. Below the Wide Field of View spacecraft is a dual payload adapter structure that connects these 2 satellites. The other satellite on board the mission is the USSF-12 Ring spacecraft, and that hosts a variety of classified experiments for the Space Force. The Space Force hasn't disclosed much detail about those experiments other than generally they're testing technologies and testing new types of space systems for future applications, including prototypes for future applications. But other than that, the Space Force hasn't really disclosed much about the particular mission of the USSF-12 Ring spacecraft. The USSF-12 Ring spacecraft, we do know, was manufactured by Northrop Grumman. And below the payload stack is the Centaur upper stage, here labeled with its RL-10 C1 engine built by Aerojet Rocketdyne. Below that is the boat tail structure that connects the Centaur upper stage and the bottom of the payload fairing to the smaller diameter, more narrow diameter of the first stage. And then the bronze first stage is also noted here, labeled as the booster. And then you can see those 4 solid rocket boosters on each side, 2 on each side of the first stage. Those SRBs are GEM 63s, or graphite epoxy motors. The 63 is the diameter, 63 inches in diameter for each of these motors, and they're built by Northrop Grumman as well. And then the main engine for this mission and all Atlas V rockets is the RD-180, supplied by MPO Energomash of Russia. And this engine will provide about 860,000 pounds of thrust during a burn lasting 4 minutes and 24 seconds during today's climb into orbit. And the RD-180, this will be the 100th RD-180 engine to fly. 94 Atlas Vs will have flown after today, and then 6 RD-180s flew on the Atlas III family back in the early 2000s. So this is the breakdown of the various components of the Atlas V that you see out on Space Launch Complex 41. In this view, the vehicle is actually partially obscured by the umbilical tower on the mobile launch platform, but you can definitely see the top of the payload fairing as well as the solid rocket boosters peeking out on each side of that umbilical tower. So now 1 hour and 14 minutes and 30 seconds until launch. The cryogenic loading continues on the Atlas V rocket. Last report was the Centaur liquid hydrogen is now 50% full. Now 1 hour, 6 minutes, and 25 seconds. We just heard in the last few moments that the Centaur liquid hydrogen tank and the Atlas liquid oxygen tank have reached near full levels and are now being topped off to flight level. 96% in the case of Centaur liquid hydrogen, 97% in the case of Atlas liquid oxygen. So in the next few minutes, we expect to hear confirmation that the Atlas V is fully loaded with its supply of propellants, these cryogenics that have been loaded in the countdown this afternoon, along with kerosene, a storable propellant that was loaded into the vehicle yesterday, and the 4 strap-on solid rocket boosters that have had their solid propellants pre-packed in their casings since they left the factory. So with all of these elements fully fueled or near fully fueled, the propellant loading process is wrapping up here at Cape Canaveral. And the countdown is continuing toward a target launch time of 6 p.m. Eastern Time or 2200 UTC. The most recent report on weather from United Launch Alliance indicated that all parameters are green at this time for launch. However, the weather conditions are still somewhat iffy, with only a 60% chance that the weather conditions will be green or go during the window, the 2-hour window this evening that opens at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. On the radar, there are several showers and thunderstorms that have popped up across the Cape Canaveral spaceport in the last half hour or so. There's also more strong activity and storm activity inland over central Florida. So the team will be monitoring these storms and their movement over the next hour or so to determine whether these storms will hold off long enough to allow the Atlas V to launch at the opening of the window. And we just heard confirmation now that the Atlas liquid oxygen tank has reached 100%. So that leaves just the Centaur liquid hydrogen tank to be loaded or to be topped off to flight level in the next few minutes. Now 1 hour 55 minutes from the opening of this evening's launch window at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, or 2200 UTC. We've just heard confirmation from ULA that the weather conditions have now gone red, or no-go. This is the observed condition here at Cape Canaveral due to a storm that's popped up just north of the launch pad, according to ULA. However, still an hour to go until the opening of the window, and then a further 2 hours of launch window available to the ULA launch team this evening to get this mission off the ground. So if the weather conditions are, these weather systems are moving through, if the storms are moving through, there is still an opportunity to launch this mission during the 2-hour window this evening. Now less than 52 minutes until the opening of today's launch window here at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Again, the weather conditions here at Cape Canaveral are currently red or no-go for launch due to a thunderstorm that has formed to the north of the launch pad. Now 50 minutes and 10 seconds until the opening of this evening's 2-hour launch window. We've heard confirmation now from United Launch Alliance's team that the Atlas V rocket is fully loaded with propellants. So about 66,000 gallons of cryogenic liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen have been loaded into the Atlas V over the course of the last hour and a half or so. Those propellants join a kerosene, which was already on board the vehicle, as well as the solid propellant packed into the motor casings on the 4 strap-on boosters. So with this, the Atlas V is fully loaded with propellant out at pad 41. Meanwhile, the weather conditions are now the topic of concern here at Cape Canaveral. The weather conditions are currently observed red, and a thunderstorm has popped up about 10 miles or so from the launch pad. You can see that cell just to the northwest of the pad in that previous radar view. That is the storm of concern right now that has caused the weather conditions to go red here at the spaceport. Still nearly 50 minutes to go until the opening of the window this afternoon, and then, as I've said before, the window extends for 2 hours this evening until 8 p.m. Eastern Time or midnight UTC. So plenty of time for this weather situation to evolve over the course of the evening, and ULA has the ability to hold the countdown. If everything else looks like it's ready to go, they can hold the countdown and wait out the weather for this 2-hour window. The big concern with the thunderstorm is, of course, lightning. Any electrification in the atmosphere could pose a threat to the Atlas V as it climbs through or near any clouds that have a charge in them. So the U.S. Space Force's 45th Weather Squadron has a network of weather instrumentation across the spaceport detecting lightning strikes, as well as sensors that detect electrification or charges in the atmosphere. So that's what's being monitored right now. Those are the weather concerns that are being watched by the weather team at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station this evening. Meanwhile, the Atlas V countdown is continuing at this point toward a built-in hold at the T-minus 4-minute point. That T-minus clock is not shown on your screen. It's the time you're seeing on your screen is the time until launch. And we've just heard from ULA's launch team, which is working over in the Atlas Spaceflight Operations Center. We just heard from ULA's launch conductor that they're going to hold off on the so-called fuel fill sequence on the RD-180 main engine, and that's expected to impact the opening of the window, according to ULA. So it's not expected right now that the launch will be happening at 6 p.m. Due to the team holding off on this fuel fill sequence to begin flowing fuel into the RD-180 engine to prepare that engine for its ignition sequence. As you can see in this view of the Atlas V out on pad 41, the skies are getting darker as the thunderstorm continues to build just to the north of the pad and to the north of our location here at the Kennedy Space Center, about 4 miles from the pad. We're hearing some thunder claps in the sky as this storm builds just to the north of the Kennedy Space Center. As I mentioned a few moments ago, just to recap, the launch team is holding off on the fuel fill sequence on the RD-180 main engine at this time. This is due to the red condition with the weather, as you can see in this view. Some clouds overhead that are threatening to be an issue for the launch this evening. However, there is a 2-hour window available for ULA to wait for the weather to clear and also to work and potentially resolve a concern with a faulty measurement associated with a propellant utilization system on the Atlas V rocket. We don't have any further details on the nature of that issue, but it's been discussed some time ago, and we haven't heard any outcome or outbrief on the anomaly team's discussion and recommendation for how to proceed with that issue. So with the fuel fill sequence not beginning on time, this is a key point in the countdown. The launch conductor says this is likely to and expected to impact the launch time, meaning that the team is not expecting this mission to get off the ground at 6 p.m. Eastern Time at the opening of the window. But the team has until 8 p.m. Eastern Time or midnight UTC to resolve this issue and wait for the weather to clear and still get the USSF-12 mission for the United States Space Force off the ground this evening. ULA's countdown has stopped at T-minus 4 minutes. This is a pre-planned built-in hold at T-minus 4 minutes. Going into the countdown, the plan was for this hold to have a duration of about 30 minutes, but the hold could be extended now with ULA working a technical issue, a sensor issue on the Atlas V, as well as the weather conditions are now red at Cape Canaveral, so the team will need to wait for those conditions to go green. The window tonight runs until 8 p.m. Eastern Time or midnight UTC. So a 2-hour window available for ULA and the Atlas V. ULA's launch countdown remains in this built-in hold at T-minus 4 minutes. There are currently three weather rules in violation or red at this time. One of those involves cumulus clouds. The other is with lightning detections around the spaceport. and the other is with surface electric field mills. These are sensors that measure the electrical charge in the atmosphere, and if those measurements reach a certain level, a certain threshold, then that parameter would be read. So these are the 3 weather rules that are currently no-go for launch. Separately, ULA and their anomaly team continued to assess a sensor issue. When it was first reported, it was reported to be part of the PU system, which is the propellant utilization system on the Atlas V rocket. We haven't heard any further details about what specific system or what part of the system these sensors or this particular sensor is part of. But the engineers haven't closed out that issue formally just yet. And while the engineers have been analyzing and assessing that issue, the launch team has held off on several of their countdown procedures that would have normally been conducted by now. Those include slew checks or steering checks of the thrust vector control on the RD-180 main engine, as well as the fuel fill sequence on the RD-180 main engine. And these checks would need to be completed before picking up with the terminal countdown at T-minus 4 minutes and counting. There hasn't been an official announcement of a new launch time or an official announcement that 6 p.m. This launch at the opening of the window at 6 p.m. Eastern Time won't be happening. However, the launch conductor, when he instructed the team earlier to hold off on the fuel fill sequence on the RD-180 main engine, said that decision would be expected to affect the launch time. So it doesn't seem likely that the launch will be happening at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The window tonight extends for 2 hours until 8 p.m. Eastern or midnight UTC to begin this mission. This mission will be deploying 2 experimental satellites for the U.S. Space Force into a geosynchronous orbit more than 22,000 miles or about 36,000 kilometers over the equator. This is a marathon mission as far as launch sequences go, about 6 hours and 5 minutes from the time of liftoff until the final of the 2 U.S. Space Force satellites is released from the Centaur upper stage. This mission is officially designated USSF-12 for United States Space Force 12, and it's the 4th Atlas V launch this year and the 94th Atlas V launch overall since this rocket debuted in August of 2002. And this mission will also mark the 28th orbital launch attempt out of the Kennedy Space Center or Cape Canaveral Space Force Station this year, as the first half of 2022 draws to a close today. If this mission gets off the ground, that'll be 28 missions accomplished or launched from the Florida Space Coast in 2022. Of those 27 missions launched to date from Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center, 22 have been with SpaceX Falcon 9 rockets, 3 with Atlas V rockets, and 2 with Astra's small satellite launch vehicle on missions carrying CubeSats to space for NASA. However, those Astra missions both failed to reach orbit with their payloads. United Launch Alliance's launch conductor just briefed his team on the status of things with the countdown. 3 weather rules are still red at this time, and those weather conditions are expected to remain red or no-go for the first hour of today's window. So that would be until roughly 7 p.m. Eastern Time or 2300 UTC. The launch weather officer still believes there is a 60% chance of favorable conditions for launch at the end of the window at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So there's some hope that these storms that have popped up, not directly over the launch pad, but within the cone around the pad, that the weather officer doesn't want lightning in during liftoff. There's some hope that these storms will move out of the area or dissipate in time for the mission to take off before 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. In the meantime, the anomaly team, the engineers that are assigned to discuss and evaluate any issues that come up during a countdown, continues to discuss a sensor issue that was detected earlier this afternoon involving the propellant utilization system on the Atlas V rocket. And there's been no resolution or no outbrief from the anomaly team yet on this issue. The Atlas V countdown remains in this hold at T-minus 4 minutes. The clock you're seeing on the upper right is the T-minus clock, which is where the official countdown clock is now at T-minus 4 minutes. This hold was expected to last 30 minutes. And if the launch was going to proceed as scheduled for 6 p.m., about this time we will be hearing the pre-launch poll from the Atlas Space Flight Operations Center of the ULA launch conductor polling his team for a go or no-go to enter the terminal countdown. However, there is at least one technical issue still under discussion involving a sensor issue of some kind on a propellant utilization system on the Atlas first stage. That is now being analyzed and has been for some time been analyzed by the anomaly team consisting of United Launch Alliance engineers. ULA has engineers on standby both here at Cape Canaveral as well as at the company's headquarters near Denver to assess any of these issues that can come up during a countdown. Aside from that sensor issue, the other big item being watched is the weather. There's a storm that has popped up in the last hour or so just to the north of the pad. This view looks north. You can see some of the cloud cover in the distance. And that storm is still holding off a few miles north of the pad. There hasn't been any rain or lightning directly over the launch complex. But the storm off to the north is actually growing in size and not moving much at this time. And the launch weather officer reported a little while ago that she expected the weather to remain red, at least for the first hour or so of the window. That would put the launch time around the 7 p.m. time frame, Eastern time, or 2300 UTC, if the weather cleared as she was forecasting. But this is an evolving weather situation here on the Florida Space Coast, so we'll see if that prediction holds true. The window tonight extends until 8 p.m. Eastern time or midnight UTC. So these afternoon and evening storms are often an issue for launches that are scheduled in these hours of the day in the summertime here in Florida. And that's an issue today with this storm just to the north of the spaceport. The launch conductor told his team also to basically put themselves into a holding pattern now. All of the preparations up to this point, for the most part, have been completed, with a couple of exceptions involving a steering check of the RD-180 main engine and the fuel fill sequence on the RD-180 main engine. Those procedures can only be completed once the anomaly team clears this issue with the propellant utilization system sensor. So we'll be back with updates as we get them from ULA. Again, the launch window opens at 6 p.m. Eastern Time and closes at 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. The Atlas V countdown continues in a hold as the weather conditions here at Cape Canaveral remain red. 3 weather rules remain no-go at last report. The surface electric field mill rule, the cumulus cloud rule, and the lightning rule due to this thunderstorm that's popped up to the north of the Kennedy Space Center. You can see here in this view to the right of the vehicle assembly building that dark cloud in the distance associated with a thunderstorm that really isn't moving much right now and has put this Atlas V countdown on hold. There's another reason, though, that the Atlas V countdown is holding, and that involves a sensor issue on the Atlas first stage with the propellant utilization system. That issue is still under assessment by engineers from United Launch Alliance. Now 12 minutes into tonight's 2-hour launch window, rather. 12 minutes into a 2-hour launch window. We just heard a report that the Launch Complex 41 area is now in a Phase 2 lightning warning. So this indicates that lightning is present in the area. You can still see some blue sky overhead and toward the east. But if you look back toward the west from our location, you can see some dark clouds just to the north and west of the vehicle assembly building from our location here at the press site. And in this angle from pad 41, you can see those dark clouds to the north and west of the launch complex itself, back behind the Atlas V in this view. The Atlas V is fully loaded with propellants. It has been for a little more than an hour now, and weighs about 1.2 million pounds with its full load of propellants on board. About 90 to 91,000 gallons of liquid propellants are currently on board the vehicle. Those are kerosene, liquid hydrogen, and liquid oxygen. And the vehicle has 4 strap-on solid rocket boosters that are also already packed with solid fuel for their burns to give the Atlas V an extra boost off the pad to begin this mission for the U.S. Space Force. So the open items still for the ULA launch team right now are this sensor issue associated with the Atlas propellant utilization system, as well as these red weather rules associated with a thunderstorm that has developed and continues to build north of the spaceport, bringing lightning and cloud cover that are violating multiple weather rules for the Atlas V to get off the ground. You can see this satellite picture shows that blossoming thunderstorm cell just to the north of the launch site. You can also see that in the radar picture here. The storm is not moving much, and no sign yet of any significant dissipation of that storm, so it remains an issue, and the weather remains red at this time. The Atlas V countdown remains in this hold, an extended hold, at T-minus 4 minutes, while the team continues to wait for the weather to clear and to finish the evaluation of this sensor issue with the propellant utilization system on the Atlas first stage. The launch window for tonight for the USSF-12 mission for the United States Space Force remains open until 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time or midnight UTC. So there's still about a little more than 90 minutes available to work this sensor issue and to wait for the weather to go green, potentially, before the end of the window tonight. The countdown is holding at T-minus 4 minutes, and once the weather goes green and the technical issue is resolved, if it is able to be resolved, the team will still need a few minutes to go through some final checks and complete their pre-launch poll. So from the time that the conditions and parameters go green, it's still a few minutes before the countdown can resume at T-minus 4 minutes. So while this countdown remains in a hold, we'll invite you to support our coverage. You can become a member, join our channel as a member on YouTube, and depending on the level of membership you choose, you can obtain exclusive access to video and discounts in the Spaceflight Now store. And our members go a long way to contributing to our coverage, helping us continue to bring you live coverage of launch and other events here on Florida's Space Coast and around the world. We also invite you to contribute on Superchat, and any contribution you give us is greatly appreciated and really helps us bring you coverage like we're bringing you today for this Atlas V countdown. While the Atlas V countdown remains in a hold, we'll show you a live view of NASA's Artemis 1 moon rocket out at Launch Complex 39B here at the Kennedy Space Center. The Artemis 1 moon rocket has completed this current latest phase of testing with a countdown dress rehearsal earlier this month that saw teams load more than 750,000 gallons of propellant into the vehicle. And there was a hydrogen leak detected during that test and a few other technical issues. However, NASA has deemed that test a success, and engineers believe they have enough data to proceed into launch preparations for this first SLS moon rocket on the Artemis 1 test flight heading around the moon, with a liftoff as soon as the end of August, if these preparations in the coming weeks go according to plan. The next step for the Artemis 1 launch campaign is to roll this 322-foot tall rocket back from Pad 39B to the vehicle assembly building. That rollback was scheduled to begin tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. However, we're learning that this rollout has now been delayed until perhaps no earlier than tomorrow evening. When this rollback occurs, when the Artemis 1 moon rocket begins its journey back to the vehicle assembly building, we'll bring you live coverage, live streaming video of this activity. It's expected to take about 8 to 12 hours to get back into the vehicle assembly building when the rollout begins, moving along the crawlerway for the 4.2 mile or roughly 6.7 kilometer journey from the pad to the hangar here at Kennedy. Looking a little farther south at Launch Complex 39A, here's a live view of SpaceX's future Starship launch facility here in Florida. The launch pad gantry tower now has 3 segments stacked, roughly 150 feet or so in height now, with these 3 segments, each about 50 feet in height, now stacked in place on the foundation of this giant tower, which will support future launches of the Super Heavy and Starship reusable rockets in development by SpaceX. This will be SpaceX's second Starship launch site after a similar pad was finished in Texas, in South Texas at Boca Chica Beach. The pad here in Florida is expected to look much the same, perhaps with a few upgrades and modifications based on lessons learned from the construction of the first launch site in Texas. So 3 of the as many as 9 segments that will be making up this tower are now in place at Pad 39A, just about 1,000 feet, or about 300 meters roughly east of the existing Falcon launch complex at 39A. You can see this giant crane that was put up earlier this month to enable the stacking of these segments. 3 of the 9 segments now in place. If you're a Spaceflight Now member, you can get access to a live stream of ongoing construction work during daytime hours at Pad 39A. So this is just a snapshot of the other activity going on here on Florida Space Coast tonight. Of course, some of you may be aware that there was a SpaceX Falcon 9 launch a little more than 24 hours ago from Pad 40. Carrying the SES-22 commercial communications satellite into orbit. And then tonight's activity, the main activity here in Florida at the Space Coast, is the scheduled launch of the ULA Atlas V rocket on the USSF-12 mission. However, the countdown is in this extended hold due to weather issues and a technical issue still under discussion by the launch team. This view of the Atlas V comes from a camera on the top of ULA's vertical integration facility. That view is looking generally north toward the Atlas V. This view comes from a camera mound to the east of the launch complex, looking generally in a west or northwest direction. You can see that dark thunderstorm cloud in the distance that's causing the weather rules to be red right now. And that's one of the reasons the countdown remains in this hold. We want to thank United Launch Alliance for bringing us access to this video throughout this phase of the countdown. We've just heard from ULA's launch team that the sensor or transducer issue that was noted earlier in the countdown with the Atlas first stage's propellant utilization system is not expected to be an issue. The anomaly team, which consists of engineers tasked with assessing issues that crop up during the countdown, recommended to the ULA launch team that they proceed with the countdown and launch. So this technical issue, the only one of note during the countdown so far, involved the loss of one of 3 transducers in the propellant utilization system on the Atlas first stage. And the anomaly team recommended to ULA's launch team that they disable this lost transducer and proceed. There's plenty of margin in the system with 2 other transducers available. And the team believes they have adequate margins, even if they lost the other 2 transducers, to safely proceed during launch. So this transducer has now been disabled, and the technical issues that technical issue has been cleared. So right now there are no open technical problems being addressed by the ULA launch team. The main concern now is weather. 4 different weather parameters are currently read according to United Launch Alliance's launch conductor. And another weather briefing to update the team on the status of the evolving weather situation is scheduled at 6:55 p.m. Eastern Time or 22:55 UTC. And given that timeline, it's likely that the launch will be delayed sometime after 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The window tonight extends until 8 p.m. Eastern Time or midnight UTC. The Atlas V countdown remains in this hold at T-minus 4 minutes. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 41. The Atlas V is fully loaded with about 91,000 gallons of liquid propellants, plus solid propellant and 4 strap-on boosters. This view comes from a ULA camera on the roof of the vertical integration facility where the Atlas V was stacked over the recent few weeks. The Atlantic Ocean in the background. You can really see the proximity of the pad to the coastline here in this view from the top of the 30-story tall vertical integration facility. We'd like to thank United Launch Alliance for giving us access to these feeds throughout this hold as we await a potential launch of the Atlas V on the USSF-12 mission. This mission will be carrying 2 experimental U.S. Space Force satellites into a geosynchronous orbit, more than 22,000 miles, or nearly 36,000 kilometers, over the equator. And to reach that orbit, the Atlas V will take about 6 hours and fire its Centaur upper stage engine 3 times to reach this high altitude orbit for deploying these satellites. One of these satellites is called the Wide Field of View Testbed, a WFOV testbed. It was built by a company called Millennium Space Systems, which is part of Boeing, and will test a next generation infrared sensor supplied by L3 Harris. And this infrared sensor is a prototype or test unit for potential future sensors that will be used to help the Space Force detect and track missiles. These infrared instruments are able to register the heat plume from missile and rocket launches and then help provide a tracking solution to the Space Force and the Missile Defense Agency and other agencies in the DoD to provide early warning of missile launches that could be threatening U.S. and allied forces. The other spacecraft on this mission is called USSF-12 Ring. It's a multi-payload spacecraft hosting multiple experiments. These experiments and payloads are classified, so the Space Force hasn't released much information about the nature of the mission that the USSF-12 spacecraft will be performing. We're going to run a video now from United Launch Alliance that shows some of the major events during this USSF-12 launch. At liftoff, the RD-180 engine will be ignited, and then these 4 solid rocket boosters from Northrop Grumman will also ignite a few seconds later, powering the Atlas V off the pad with about 2.3 million pounds of thrust. This launch vehicle, about 196 feet tall, will pitch toward the east, head down range, and surpass the speed of sound in about a minute or so after launch, 57 seconds actually. A few moments later, it will pass maximum dynamic pressure. And then these 4 solid rocket boosters will exhaust their propellant about 100 seconds into the mission and then jettison to fall into the Atlantic Ocean. This shows the trajectory that the Atlas V will be following, heading roughly due east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. After the jettison of the solid rocket boosters, the RD-180 main engine, burning kerosene and liquid oxygen, will continue firing for more than 4 minutes, producing about 860,000 pounds of thrust during that burn. Late in the first stage burn, we expect to see the jettison of the payload fairing from the Atlas V rocket. Here you see the fairing with its ART visible, decals representing the mission for the United States Space Force. This fairing will be jettisoned after the rocket reaches space to reveal those 2 satellites to the space environment. And then booster engine cutoff is expected at T+4 minutes and 24 seconds. Retro thrusters will fire to push the first stage booster away from the Centaur upper stage. And then the Centaur will go into a so-called pre-start sequence and then ignite its Aerojet Rocketdyne RL-10 engine for the first of 3 burns on today's mission. It'll reach a preliminary parking orbit after the first burn and then reignite about 23 minutes after liftoff for a second burn to propel these 2 spacecraft into a highly elliptical transfer orbit that reaches an apogee of more than 22,000 miles. A third burn, nearly 6 hours after liftoff, will circularize that orbit at 22,400 miles or so, about 36,100 kilometers. Here you see a graphic from ULA showing the shape of that elliptical orbit. It'll be reshaped into a more circular orbit after this third Centaur burn, nearly 6 hours into the mission. The Wide Field of View testbed spacecraft, which is riding in the upper position on the Atlas V tonight, will be deployed first from the Centaur upper stage. This illustrates that circular geosynchronous orbit over the equator that is being targeted tonight on this USSF-12 mission. After the Wide Field of View spacecraft is free of the rocket, the Centaur will jettison an adapter structure to reveal the USSF-12 rideshare payload for separation. And that spacecraft, which is based on a ring structure and it was built by Northrop Grumman, will separate from the Centaur upper stage at 2 + 6 hours and 5 minutes to conclude tonight's launch, carrying these two spacecraft to a high-altitude orbit for the U.S. Space Force. We're back now live at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, looking toward Space Launch Complex 41. On the right side of your screen, you can see the vertical integration facility. The camera view I called out earlier is from a camera on that building, looking down toward the Atlas V rocket on pad 41. Right now, there are no technical issues under discussion by the ULA launch team. The only issue right now is weather. At last report, 4 weather rules were read. However, there is another weather briefing underway as we speak, and we'll stand by for the outcome of that briefing in the next few minutes. This view comes from the causeway at Cape Canaveral, coming to us live thanks to Michael Kane, a photographer, who's providing us with this feed, giving us a different angle on the Atlas V as it counts down toward a potential launch opportunity tonight. The window tonight extends until 8 p.m. Eastern Time or midnight UTC. The latest update from United Launch Alliance's launch conductor is that weather remains red due to thunderstorm activity around the Cape Canaveral spaceport area. There has not been any significant rainfall out at the pad, but all the activity is just a few miles to the north and west of the pad at this time. Still within the limit to violate weather criteria, though. The lightning and cloud criteria currently red. You can see in the satellite picture that billowing cloud deck from a thunderstorm firing up earlier this afternoon, and the clouds spreading over Cape Canaveral. The intensity on the radar return is not as significant and as strong as it was a little earlier, but still plenty of heavy activity just to the north and west of the pad right now. ULA's launch conductor and launch director have agreed to convene another weather briefing in about 15 minutes or so at 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time, or 23:20 UTC. And at that point, they say they're likely to make a decision on whether to proceed with the rest of the countdown based on how the weather is looking at that point. The window tonight extends until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, or midnight UTC. And there are some hydraulic system preps that the launch team will need to get through if they decide to proceed with the countdown. And they want plenty of time to do that, so they're going to make a decision, it sounds like, in about 15 to 20 minutes. The Atlas V countdown remains in this hold at T-minus 4 minutes as the team waits out some bad weather in the area. You may be hearing a few rumbles of thunder on the feed right now. This is from a lightning strike we just had in the area around the Kennedy Space Center press site. We're located about 4 miles west of the Atlas V launch pad, and we're continuing to hear thunder in the sky now. Another weather briefing from the launch weather officer to ULA's launch team is scheduled to begin in about 4 minutes at 7:20 p.m. Eastern or 23:20 UTC. And we expect to perhaps hear a decision from ULA's launch director and launch conductor after that weather briefing on whether the odds of weather going green by 8 p.m., the closing of the window, are high enough to make a run at launching this evening to continuing the countdown in hopes that weather goes green, or if the weather it doesn't look like it's going to improve, there's a chance the team could decide to call it a night and scrub the launch. So decisions to be made in a few minutes' time. We'll stand by for that news. This weather briefing is now underway between the launch weather officer and the Atlas V launch team. And you can see in this view the clouds are looking rather grim off to the north and west of the Atlas V. There's still some blue sky in the eastern direction from our vantage point here at Kennedy Space Center, but it's cloudy overhead, and off to the north and west it is particularly dark with occasional thunder.
Red strokes inside that 10 nautical mile ring by 23:28 Zulu in order to get the 30-minute countdown timer to go down by, for us to notify that we're green for the lightning rule, to go down in time for the last minute of the window at 0 Zulu. Not only that, we are still red for the surface electric field mill rule, and they have not started to count down or their 15-minute countdown timer yet, and they will not start to count down until we get a little bit of a cool off in the lightning within about 10 nautical miles of the launch pad. But we expect to clear the cumulus cloud rule last, with all of these cumulus clouds associated with thunderstorm activity moving in from the west and continuing to remain within 10 nautical miles. They are all well above the height.
Listening to the launch weather officer give her a weather briefing to the Atlas V team
the
right now.
cloud rule, and we expect them to stick around inside of 10 nautical miles through 0 Zulu. So we have updated our estimated clear times for the surface electric fields rule for 0Z, the lightning rule, and the cumulus cloud rule for 0030Z, 30 minutes after the end of the window, and the attached anvil cloud rule for 0 Zulu. This concludes the weather brief. Are there any questions?
RC has no questions. Indicate questions or acknowledge. LD.
Hello, stand by just one moment.
Standing by.
Hello, would like to check back with you one more time. Please plan to give us one more update at 23:30.
Copy that.
No other questions from LD.
Copy. MD.
No other questions from MD.
LV1.
LV1.
And DE.
D.
Thank you, OL.
As you heard, the launch weather officer gave a pretty grim forecast for the rest of the window tonight. The window has about 36 minutes left until the close time of 8 p.m. Eastern, or 000 Zulu, or GMT or UTC. So with that, ULA's launch team has requested one more weather briefing in about 6 minutes to get a further update on the progression and evolution of the storms over Cape Canaveral this evening. Right now there are multiple weather rules that are red. One of those is the cumulus cloud rule. There's also an anvil cloud rule that's red, a lightning rule that's red, and the surface electric field mill rule is also red. That rule involves the measurement of the electrical charge in the atmosphere for potential lightning. And the weather officer said that she doesn't expect the final, the last of those weather rules to go green until around 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. That's about 30 minutes after the close of tonight's launch window. That wasn't a very optimistic outlook, but ULA's team is going to request one more briefing in about 5 minutes to get the very latest information before making a decision on whether to proceed with a countdown this evening in hopes that the weather clears, or to call it a night and make another attempt later. The final weather brief is now
This is
underway. We'll
Zello on
listen
Net
in
8.
on that now.
Please stand by.
Standing by.
This is RC on Weather Conference Net 8. Indicate ready to proceed. LD.
LD.
MD.
MD.
LV1.
LB1.
DE.
DE.
Please proceed, OL.
Okay, you should be looking at the intercloud lightning. We have plenty of fresh lightning strikes between 5 and 10 nautical miles, both to our west-northwest and to our north. This lightning, there's no way to get out of a 30-minute timer, with the exception of having no cumulus clouds within 10 nautical miles, which is going to be near impossible to do in the next 30 minutes due to the radar and a new cumulus cloud thunderstorm building just west of us and moving in. This is also likely going to give you a moderate, potentially brief period of heavy rain right around 0015 Zulu as it approaches the pad. So things are looking closer to a 99% POV at 0 Zulu. Are there any questions?
No questions from the RC. Indicate questions are acknowledged, LD.
LWO, if you wouldn't mind, could you go ahead and take us through tomorrow's briefing?
Sure. I have not changed the forecast for tomorrow. Honestly, it's
So you heard that briefing from the launch weather officer, indicating a 99% chance of that the weather constraints will continue to be red for the rest of the window, which extends till 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll await a decision. We expect a decision very shortly from United Launch Alliance on their next steps for this countdown. We were hoping to hear the weather forecast for the potential launch attempt tomorrow, but ULA cut the audio of the weather briefing before the weather officer was able to give her a response on the POV, or the probability of violation, for the weather forecast for the Friday evening launch attempt.
Declared a scrub for today's operations. Please prepare the team for a 24-hour recycle.
Roger, scrub with the 24-hour recycle. We'll proceed into scrub detanking up.
And there you
All
heard
right,
the
team,
direction.
LC Net 1, great effort getting us into this attempt. Fortunately, weather's not cooperating with us today. So we'll proceed in Operation 90. Flight control, LC. Go ahead, this flight control, step 30.
And you heard the direction there from the mission director relayed through the launch director that tonight's countdown has been scrubbed. So there won't be the launch of the Atlas V rocket tonight as we were expecting. due to bad weather. There was a persistent cloud cover and lightning around the Cape Canaveral spaceport throughout the launch window, and the weather conditions were red, have been red for more than 2 hours now, and no hope of that weather going green until after the closing of the window tonight. So with that, ULA plans to drain cryogenic propellants from the Atlas V rocket later tonight. They'll drain the 66,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen that were loaded this afternoon, and then set up for what they call a 24-hour recycle, which is to set up for another launch attempt tomorrow. The launch window tomorrow would be the same as tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 2200 UTC, with a 2-hour window available. We weren't able to hear the weather forecast for tomorrow from the launch weather officer. ULA turned off her briefing before she got to that. So we'll be sure to share that information with you on social media and on our website, spaceflightnow.com, when we get it. The only technical issue of note during the countdown involved a bad sensor, or bad transducer, rather, associated with the propellant utilization system on the Atlas first stage. But ULA engineers, after studying that issue for some time, concluded that wasn't a problem, that wasn't an issue that would have prevented the launch this evening. There are backup redundant transducers available, and plenty of margin, the engineers said, even if all the transducers were to fail, to maintain a safe flight. The other activity we expected to see happen tonight here on Florida's Space Coast was the rollback of the NASA Space Launch System moon rocket to the Vehicle Assembly Building for final launch preparations. This 322-foot tall rocket has been out at Pad 39B since June the 6th for testing, culminating in a countdown dress rehearsal earlier this month. And NASA has declared that dress rehearsal campaign is complete and is proceeding toward launch preparations for liftoff of the Artemis 1 test flight as soon as the end of August. This is an unpiloted flight of NASA's giant space launch system and Orion spacecraft around the moon. So we hope to see this. We hoped to see this moon rocket return to the Vehicle Assembly Building tonight, but NASA earlier this evening confirmed that the rollback won't be happening due to concern with the condition of the crawlerway. This is the pathway made up of rock dredged from riverbeds that leads between the Vehicle Assembly Building out to Pad 39B. There were teams here at the Kennedy Space Center conducted a series of conditioning efforts this afternoon to move the giant, massive crawler transporter up and down the ramp at Pad 39B to check the leveling of the slope that leads up to the pad. But the results weren't what engineers expected or needed to be able to proceed with the rollback tonight. So ground crews here at the Kennedy Space Center will continue grading and making more attempts to level out the crawlerway overnight in hopes of a rollback to the Vehicle Assembly Building tomorrow. The first motion of the Space Launch System, the beginning of the rollback, is scheduled for 6 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. And coincidentally, that's the same time as the opening of the Atlas V launch window tomorrow. So we may be tracking two activities in parallel throughout the evening tomorrow, with the rollback of the Artemis 1 moon rocket and the launch of the Atlas V vehicle from Pad 41. Meanwhile, we'll give you one more look of the activity out at Launch Complex 39A, which is leased by SpaceX. You can see the tower gantry structure for SpaceX's next generation Super Heavy booster and Starship rocket program taking shape at Pad 39A. 3 of the as many as 9 segments that will eventually make up this tower that will stand more than 450 feet tall have been placed into position out at Pad 39A. You can see this crane is in position to lift a 4th segment in the coming days. This location is about 1,000 feet or about 300 meters east of the Falcon 9 launch facility at Pad 39A, inside the perimeter of this historic launch complex. If you want to become a Spaceflight Now member, you can watch continuing live views of the operations out at Pad 39A as SpaceX constructs this pad during daylight hours. If you want to support our coverage, you can also become a member of our YouTube channel. And depending on your membership level that you choose, you can get access to exclusive video as well as discounts on the Spaceflight Now store. Any contribution you can provide through our membership programs really helps us continue and expand our coverage of spaceflight activity. We'll leave you now with one more look at the Atlas V rocket, standing nearly 20 stories tall out on Pad 41. With the scrub confirmed, the next activity will be the draining of propellants, and then teams will reconfigure and reconvene for another countdown tomorrow, the same time tomorrow, with the launch targeted at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 2200 UTC. Until tomorrow, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live from Spaceflight Now, live from the Kennedy Space Center. Have a good night.